Why are there so many ways to build things? Do we need this entire ecosystem of software to really support businesses? At the end of the day, at least on AWS as a platform, what's the majority of code? It's like glue code. You're gluing services together, right? So do we need this entire ecosystem to ultimately support businesses? Do we need all of this complexity? So that brings me to chapter 2, the present, where we're at today. I mean, a few years back, but still roughly where we're at today. And really introducing the serverless compute model. So AWS Lambda was launched, I think, in beta or preview, whatnot, in 2014, so 4 years ago now. And I think before I get into this, I mean, okay, how many of you like full out know and understand what serverless is? Hands up. Okay, actually, Chris Munz is at the back there from AWS raising his hand. Okay, cool. That's awesome. I'm really glad I have this audience. And a huge question that everybody gets who's working in this space is like, okay, well, it's called serverless, but like, where are the servers? The answer is that the servers are still there. You just don't have to touch or manage them, right? So ultimately, what serverless really means and what serverless technologies are is serverless technologies roll up 2 decades or more of infrastructure abstraction and utilize economies of scale of the massive winners in the space, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, to provide instant on-demand computation with zero infrastructure management. So serverless doesn't mean there's no servers, it just means you don't have to think about the servers. On-demand computation. So who are the serverless vendors, enterprise? I mean, if there's anybody from like IBM and stuff here, people are gonna chastise me for this. But really there are like three big players in the space. IBM has their own platform, et cetera. But the 3 main vendors, and you'll hear from some of these people today, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. So what are the benefits of serverless computation, function as a service? This on-demand, I don't have to worry about servers. I can use this like 20 years of stuff Keith just talked to us about and just get instant on-demand compute. Well, it's a simplified compute model. You get a single function, single endpoint. So if you remember my slide earlier, I had single script, single endpoint with the LAMP stack, but single function, single endpoint. And ultimately, the reason that serverless and function as a service is really powerful is because you can use it to solve a business need really quickly. So, I mean, you'll hear stuff about pricing and like not over or under provisioning, and all of that stuff is super valuable, but ultimately, it allows you to deliver on business needs very, very quickly. And so that's what I mean by that is essentially just responding to an event within an ecosystem with a little bit of code, right? Do I have an upload? Chris Munz back there, do I have an upload to S3? Do I have like a Stripe completed payment? Do I want to write a little bit of code around that? Where does that live? You can use serverless to solve these problems very, very quickly. So web development in 2018, you remember my slide earlier? I mean, it's really the simplest it's ever been if you're using the right serverless abstractions and the right platforms. So you go from a script, essentially the script just exports a single function on your computer, and using a web framework, you can upload to platforms. I've included standard library there first. Shout out to us, but AWS, Azure, GCP, as long as you're using deployment frameworks, they offer native deployment frameworks, and there are also companies like Begin, which you'll hear about today, that allow you to very quickly and easily deploy functions. Really, you don't even have that server in between. Just like upload it to this cloud platform, and the cloud platform will figure the rest of it out. So web development, simplest it has ever been in 2018. So really, we've come full circle. Now, I use this quote. I gave a talk here at the inaugural Functions Conference last year that was really focused around this quote. But Timo Mialov basically said, PHP was 15 to 20 years ahead of the serverless curve. You just uploaded your code, and the hosting provider took care of the rest. Yeah, they couldn't really give you the scale that serverless does today, but like more or less from a developer standpoint, from somebody that's actually building and shipping software and trying to solve business needs, this is essentially correct. Okay, that's great. What are people building with serverless web technologies, right? So this is serverless.com, Serverless Incorporated. I think you'll hear from Nick at Serverless today. He has a talk. So this is part of Serverless did a community survey a couple months back to basically say, like, what are people actually building with serverless web technologies today? By far, 1/3 of respondents, like at least in terms of frequency, what you're building the most of, 1/3 of respondents answered backend APIs. And then data processing, this is I didn't write this, I pulled this off a blog. So data processing is number 2. Integrating third-party services, internal tooling, chatbots, and Internet of Things. I want to highlight a few use cases. Really, I think everything is going to be decomposable here, but I want to highlight a few use cases. Backend APIs, obviously a third of people working with serverless tech are building backend APIs. I also want to focus on integrating third-party services. When you think about integrating third-party services, what does that mean? You're integrating with third-party APIs. When you're talking about internal tooling, what are you talking about? You're building internal APIs. When you're talking about chatbots, what are you talking about? You're talking about building an API that responds to like an event in Slack, right? So these are ultimately all APIs. And so I want to talk about serverless vendors in terms of API integration. So not like the big three, like yes, hookup functions however you want to. I'm talking about building APIs and integrating APIs specifically. We have platforms like Twilio. Twilio is doing great this year, by the way. I'll actually talk about that in a sec. We have companies like Twilio that have launched Twilio Functions, which is their abstraction layer. Just basically, can we allow people who use the Twilio platform to send text messages? Can we allow them to write business logic really easily within the Twilio ecosystem that still falls under like our enterprise SLA, et cetera? PubNub, similar messaging API platform, same thing. PubNub launched PubNub functions. I think this was last year, 2017 now. So what we do at Standard Library is we're really focused around allowing people to build and integrate APIs specifically. So not all of these like random use cases for serverless. We have our own cloud. We don't work within the context of AWS. And where this is important is a couple of other players in the game, Stripe and Slack. So Stripe and Slack are actually two of our investors. So Stripe and Slack, two huge, Slack from a communications API perspective, building chatbots, and Stripe like API for financial payment processing. Stripe is actually our largest investor to date. So we're actively working with teams at Stripe and Slack to make API integration using serverless technologies as easy as humanly possible using our software. So chapter 3. The future. What is the future of serverless web technology? So we're here learning about serverless today. What is the future here, right? So I'm going to ask this question: are we married to the term serverless? And Chris at the back, he's on his phone, but he might roll his eyes at me asking this. But are we married to the term serverless? And for those of you unfamiliar with sort of the serverless ecosystem, there's been a debate sort of since day one. People are like, oh, well, like horseless carriage, hence the name of this talk, right? Are we really going to use this term serverless? But it's like descriptive. Well, at least it gets people interested. It's actually like anti-descriptive because they're still served. But anyway, it gets people interested. It's a term that has been adopted for better or for worse. But the reason I ask why we're married to it, it's a trend. The term is not going anywhere. When you talk to somebody, you can be like, I use a serverless stack. I use serverless technologies. People are generally going to know what you're talking about. But the question I have is not like, should we just come up with another name, like people serviceful, whatever. No, serverless is here to stick as a name today, right? But my question about serverless, is it part of an even larger trend that will create or propel another technology forward or another type of or way of building, right? And so let's reflect on what I've talked about so far, right? So serverless computation, function as a service, simplified computation model, single function, single endpoint. Development is easier than it's ever been, and it solves a business need very quickly. So you're responding to an event within an ecosystem with code, right? Reflect on the use cases. I highlighted all of these things. Ultimately, everything here can be boiled down to APIs. So what's the business need, right? Let's just list these things out. Backend APIs, these things, integrating third-party services, internal tooling chatbots. Ultimately, as I've already mentioned, these things all fall under the category of people just building application programming interfaces so other people can interface with their software. I'm essentially talking about glue code, right? Glue APIs, glue code. So the serverless carriage, the title of this talk. Let's talk about semantics here. I'm not saying serverless isn't a useful term. I'm not saying it hasn't been widely adopted. I'm not saying it's going anywhere today. But we invent and use transitional terms all of the time, right? Title of this talk, serverless carriage. Horseless carriage went to motor car because it's not horseless, there's a motor. And then, I don't know, nobody says like, hey, let's go jump in my motor car. Let's just go for a ride in my car, right? It started as cordless phones and then wireless phones, and then it's not wireless, and whatever, it's a mobile phone, and then nobody says, hey Jacob, can you show me your mobile phone? No, it's can you just give me your phone now? Sometimes, I guess for sales purposes, people call them smartphones. But so my question here is serverless really a transitional term? I think the answer is probably yes, maybe not, but is serverless a transitional term? So the thesis here is the main utility of serverless compute as measured by companies in this room today. So Nick is going to give a talk. He works at Serverless Inc. So that was their survey where they surveyed how people were using serverless, is building and connecting APIs without friction. So the serverless carriage, the statement is horseless is to carriage as serverless is to API. Is this the true value of serverless, right? Well, let's like dig into this a little bit. I mean, we're all familiar with APIs. We don't really have to dig deep to find the success of APIs, and really API-focused companies. Back a decade ago, nobody believed that you could build a company that just offered a single API, right? We look at messaging APIs. Twilio has grown in the public markets almost 4x this year. I have a friend that works at Twilio that's like super psyched and won't stop talking to me about how well the Twilio stock is doing. So I mean, Twilio's their public stock has grown almost 4x this year. We have communication APIs. Just a month ago, Slack announced another round of investment. Slack obviously has communication APIs that allow you to build bots within their platform. Their valuation is topping $7.1 billion. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the news from like literally 2 days ago, but Stripe is now valued at $20 billion after selling 1% of their company for $245 million. And these companies are just offering APIs, fundamentally or primarily, right? So my view of the future, or a view of the future that I'll posit here, is look, as we develop and the serverless ecosystem grows and more people adopt this technology, people will try, they're already trying, by the way, and I'll talk about this in a second, but people will try to define and redefine serverless for whatever suits their needs, right? As long as it generates interest, intrigue, and can be used as a launch pad to sell technology. I mean, I'm pretty sure Google at, whether it was Google I/O or one of the other Google conferences, got on stage and it's like, oh yeah, you can use Kubernetes to do serverless. And it's like, well, no, that's not really like the point of serverless, because if you're managing Kubernetes, you're managing server clusters and container clusters, and like, no. But people are going to use this term to try and sell stuff to you, right? But serverless, like all software and infrastructure, is the means to an end. And that ends, I'll propose anyway, is building APIs to connect businesses. It's one of the reasons I really like the title of this conference. Yeah, it's serverless days because we're part of this serverless ecosystem, but I really like the spirit of functions conference because we're shipping code with functions, right? And we're building things that affect our business materially on a day-to-day basis. So the hypothesis on development here is serverless computation will fundamentally reshape the entire software development ecosystem. If this is your first experience with serverless, you're gonna jump in and start using some of these tools today and realize how easy it makes your life. It will primarily do this by enabling less technical workers and non-developers and increased capacity to learn about, build, and integrate with APIs. What do I mean by that? How many of you in this room are professional software engineers? Show of hands. Okay. Vast majority, that's awesome. You guys are all gonna be able to jump into using serverless technologies with whatever platform you want today. There's an entire greenfield opportunity space of people who are smart and competent enough to build and utilize code that really have been gatekept out of this industry because managing servers and infrastructure and what have you is really just too much knowledge to consume to like actually execute on a business need. So serverless technology is ultimately gonna culminate in bringing code to more and more people, tens of millions, right? There's 20 to 30 million registered developers on GitHub right now. There's at least that many lying in wait. So the conclusion, serverless, reshaping the landscape. So let's recap here. What is the past? Serverless exists as a final step of a decades-long journey to develop and distribute web-based software at scale. It does this just using economies of scale, right? Present, what do we do today with serverless technologies? So you can use serverless technologies today. You can leave this conference and go do this to drastically increase the iteration speed of your software development teams. You can just build and ship that much faster. What are most people doing with this? Most people are building APIs. The future is, as a result of serverless compute, everyone, ideally, or at least a huge chunk of like more people, a much broader ecosystem, will be able to build with and use APIs. So if you're interested in learning more, this will be the shout out to Standard Library. If you're interested in learning more, you can check us out, STDLIB, just like the C Standard Lib, standardlib.com. We're Standard Library, and we are a serverless platform really focused on API development for that emerging cohort of like non-developers. So people on your team that could use code, or even if you just want to ship something really quickly and you're like, where does this live? check out standard library, especially if you're building APIs. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Cool. So thank you. You can reach me by email, keith@standardlib.com. Literally anyone, feel free to email me. And my Twitter is @KeithWHR, so feel free to follow me. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference today.